You swear you've moved on. Time passed, the messages stopped, the meetings ended, and yet, in silent nights or distracted breaks, your fingers glide across the screen, searching for him. The profile is still there, new photos, stories, a world that seems to go on as usual without you. And every quick hidden view brings that mix of anguish, curiosity, and a strange hope. What does this silent gesture really reveal? And why, even when all reason says it's over, something inside you still insists on returning? In this video, we will dive deep into the invisible reasons that make us revisit the past through the lens of analytical psychology. Jung shows us there's much more behind this seemingly harmless habit. Perhaps by understanding this impulse, you'll begin to understand yourself. If this resonates with you, comment, "I choose to free myself from what invisibly binds me." According to Jung, what attracts or disturbs us in another person usually isn't just about them, but about parts of ourselves we haven't yet recognized. The act of repeatedly checking someone's profile from your past isn't solely about them, but about an active projection still alive within you. Projection, in Jungian terms, is the unconscious mechanism by which we displace internal aspects, desires, fears, needs, onto external figures. By accessing that person's profile, even months later, we're not merely checking their life. We're trying to keep alive a connection to what that figure symbolized in our psyche. Attachment intensifies when there was no emotional integration of the breakup. That means parts of our shadow, like feelings of abandonment, the need for validation, or the fear of loneliness, remain unacknowledged. Jung teaches us that true transformation happens when we integrate these fragments instead of projecting them. It's also part of the individuation process, discovering who we are beyond the emotional bonds that defined us. Moreover, our internal masculine and feminine, animus and anima, play a vital role. Often, we project onto the other the archetype of the ideal partner, turning that person into a mirror of our unconscious. When that figure leaves, the emptiness seems unbearable, not because of them per se, but because of the symbolic collapse they represent. So checking his profile is a symptom of the soul-seeking completeness, a call to turn inward, listen to what remains unspoken, and finally begin the true process of healing. When a relationship ends, we expect everything connected to it to dissolve. The meetings, the conversations, the shared plans. But there's something that doesn't obey that logic, the psychic bond. Even if time passes and physical contact disappears, the internal tie can remain alive, as if refusing to accept reality. It's in this gap between the concrete end and the symbolic persistence that the almost automatic impulse to check the other's profile arises. Like viewing their current life is a way of keeping an invisible thread still connected. Jung understood the human psyche as a complex universe where linear time rarely governs emotions. For consciousness, the relationship is over. But for the unconscious, the energy invested in that bond continues seeking form, expression, and recognition. This internal movement creates the illusion of emotional continuity, the feeling that even without reciprocation, something is unfinished. The gesture of checking the profile becomes a silent ritual that keeps this illusion alive, a symbolic substitute for the lost contact. This illusion isn't naive. It fulfills an important psychic role, even if dysfunctional. When part of us refuses to accept the loss, it's usually because the bond represented more than the person. It carried deep meanings that touched our identity, our needs, our hopes. The relationship then becomes a container for projections. And by projecting onto the other what we lack internally, we end up living through them. The end of the relationship thus isn't just losing someone, but the collapse of part of our own psychic structure. The mind insists on maintaining the connection because in a way it wasn't just an external relationship, it was also part of our internal world. When someone occupies a symbolic space in our life, their physical absence isn't enough to nullify their psychic presence, and that's where the suffering intensifies. Checking his profile may seem trivial, but it represents an attempt to keep alive something that no longer exists in the concrete world. It's an unconscious resistance to accept finitude. Often the difficulty in cutting this tie is linked to the absence of an emotional rite of passage. Society teaches us how to start relationships, but rarely how to symbolically close them. Without that internal closing, we remain stuck in incomplete emotional circuits, like ghosts roaming the corridors of the past. And the more time we spend feeding this illusory connection, the farther we move from integrating the experience as learning. In this process, the mind uses defensive mechanisms to avoid real grief. Grieving demands pain, acknowledgement of loss, processing absence. It's easier to keep the illusion that something's still there, a chance, an explanation, a gap. But that insistence saps vital energy, imprisoning the soul in a time that no longer exists. Jung said that what doesn't reach consciousness returns as fate. In other words, what isn't faced and processed tends to repeat in other forms with other people, creating patterns of suffering. Healing begins when we can look at this illusion and recognize what it conceals. When we honestly ask, what exactly am I looking for when I access this profile? What part of me is still trapped there? What in me refuses to move on? Only then does the compulsive gesture weaken and we start to reclaim the power we gave away, not because they took something, but because we projected onto them something that really needed to be discovered within us. Thus, abandoning the habit of checking the other's profile isn't just stopping the glance. It's a symbolic act of breaking the illusion of emotional continuity. It's silently declaring, I accept the end. And from there, beginning a new kind of relationship, not with them, but with one's own depths. When we repeatedly look at the profile of someone no longer part of our lives, we're not just observing a person, we're revisiting a symbol. Carl Jung shows that often we don't see the other as they really are, but as an unconscious representation of aspects within us that we desire, fear, or deny. This phenomenon is projection, a psychic process where internal attributes are ascribed to someone external, creating an image laden with meanings far beyond objective reality. Idealizing someone is, in this context, an intense form of projection. During a relationship or even after it ends, the other becomes a mirror of qualities we admire, needs we seek to fill, or expectations we've built over time. The real person, with imperfections and contradictions, gives way to an almost mythological figure, constructed from elements of our unconscious. Checking their social media is largely an attempt to stay in contact with this idealized figure, not with who they are now, but with what they meant to our psyche. The danger of idealization is that it impedes individuation, the process Jung describes as the path to becoming who we truly are. While projecting our inner contents onto someone else, we stop looking inward. We start seeking externally what should be developed internally. In idealizing someone, we build an emotional narrative that imprisons us. That person comes to represent what we believe we need to be whole. And the more they drift from our life, the larger the symbol grows, since there's no confrontation with reality, only with fantasy. On social media, this mechanism intensifies. The curation of another's life, smiling photos, showcased achievements, happy moments, fuels the imagination even more. When you access his profile, you're not just seeing what he's doing, you're confronted with a version of him that can reactivate all the meanings that were projected. The idealized image gains strength because it becomes untouchable, unreal, and thus all the more seductive. It's the archetype of the ideal partner activated, an internal figure shaped by affective needs and personal history, brought to life through someone specific. At this point, the psyche finds itself divided. Part of you knows the relationship is over, that there were flaws, hurts, disappointments, but another part, deeper and silent, still believes there's something essential there, something that could fill a void you might not even be able to name. This belief is sustained by unrecognized projection, and until it's withdrawn from the other and reintegrated into your interior, the impulse to return to the profile, to watch, compare, and fantasize will act as a repetitive, exhausting cycle. Jung asserted that withdrawing projection is one of the most painful and liberating moments of therapy, because when we recognize that the other isn't what we imagined, we're forced to face what led us to create that image. The other ceases to be responsible for our contentment or frustration. The focus shifts to ourselves, our wounds, our idealizations, our longing for emotional salvation. At that moment, the symbolic figure dissolves and we can finally see the human being behind the projection. Breaking with idealization doesn't mean devaluing what was lived. It means freeing yourself from the symbolic prison that prevents you from moving on. When you stop checking his profile, you're not just distancing yourself from a digital presence. You're refusing to nourish an image that no longer serves your growth process. You're telling your psyche, I no longer need to project, I'm ready to integrate. And that decision, even if silent, transforms everything. because by withdrawing from the other the responsibility for how you feel, you take back power over your own journey. You understand that they may never have been everything you believed, but that this construction had a purpose, to show what was yet to be recognized within you. The impulse to check someone's profile, even long after a relationship has ended, is often not driven by consciousness, but by invisible forces operating in the deepest layers of the psyche. Carl Jung called this hidden dimension the unconscious, and within it resides the shadow, the sum of everything we couldn't accept in ourselves that we repressed, ignored, or rejected. When this content isn't acknowledged, it begins to act upon our choices, habits, and affections in a silent but insistent way. The repetition of attachment is one of its symptoms. The emotional shadow at play in effective bonds isn't necessarily composed only of negative aspects. Often it holds vulnerable, sensitive, and loving parts that were wounded at some point and, for protection, were locked away. Thus, when we attach intensely and lastingly to someone, that person can activate dormant contents. And when the bond breaks, the pain of loss is not only for the other, but for that part of ourselves that was awakened and once again left alone. The habit of checking his profile then becomes an unconscious attempt to stay in touch with that forgotten part, the wound in the shadow that still pulses. It's common for the repetition of attachment to bring a sense of lack of control. You might even promise yourself you'll stop, that you'll leave it behind, but days later find yourself there again, looking as if something bigger is at the helm. And it is. The collective unconscious, combined with your personal history, creates archetypal patterns that guide your reactions without your awareness. Behind every click, every profile visit, there's an invisible script replaying, often for years, across different relationships with different faces, but the same emotional outcome. This repetition is a call for awareness. Jung said that what isn't brought to consciousness manifests as destiny. That is, until the shadow is recognized, it will continue creating situations where it can express itself, even if that involves suffering. The pain of attachment isn't only about the other. It's in essence a summons to look within and perceive what still needs to be rescued. Excessive attachment often hides a deep fear of emptiness, loneliness, abandonment. And that fear didn't arise with this relationship. It's ancient, rooted in earlier experiences, perhaps even childhood. The relationship that ended was only the stage. The play was written long before, and by accessing his profile, you're unconsciously trying to reenact that play, hoping for a different ending. But the true end only comes when you recognize that the transformation isn't in the other, it's in you. Stopping the repetition of attachment isn't a purely rational decision. It's a journey of self-knowledge, where you need the courage to face the parts of you that hurt, that feel loss, that still cry in the dark. When you begin to ask yourself, why does this still bind me? What part of me refuses to let go? You're opening space for the shadow to emerge, and when it emerges, it loses unconscious power over you. The pain begins to dissolve, not because the other changes, but because you change how you relate to that pain. Attachment weakens when you realize that what you sought in the other was actually an attempt to rediscover yourself. That rediscovery is the true act of liberation. And, ironically, it only becomes possible when you stop fleeing from what you fear most. The shadow, once integrated, stops being a threat and becomes an ally. It reveals what's hidden behind the craving, the obsession, the longing that never ends. And the gesture of checking the profile, which once seemed harmless, now reveals itself as a clear symptom that a part of you is asking to be heard, understood, and freed. From this perspective, every repetitive impulse becomes an invitation to delve deeper, and instead of following the same cycle, you begin to chart a new path where attachment gives way to awareness and pain transforms into power. Throughout life, we're led to believe that we become complete when we find someone who fills us. This idea, as widespread as it is illusory, conceals a deeper truth. Completeness doesn't come from the other, but from within. Carl Jung proposed that the true purpose of existence isn't to please or fuse with anyone, but to individuate, to become what one is in essence. And on this path, relationships play a central role, not because they complete us, but because they reveal, by contrast and impact, what still needs to be recognized in us. When you keep accessing the profile of someone with whom you had an effective bond, even after it's over, you're dealing with more than nostalgia or attachment. You face an internal fork, One part of you wants to move on, but another clings to the past. This duality is precisely where the individuation process begins. Instead of fighting the impulse or blaming yourself for it, Jung invites us to listen to it. What is this gesture trying to communicate? What part of you is still bound? Which psychic need remains unanswered? Individuation starts when we stop looking outside for what we lack inside. Upon realizing that the bond is no longer functional, but still carries symbolic force, we can turn it into learning. This doesn't mean erasing the story or denying the feelings, but giving them a new place in the psyche, no longer as anchors that impede movement, but as beacons pointing to where we need to go. The relationship that ended wasn't in vain. It was a mirror, and what you saw there, love, desire, need, fear, hope, are fragments of your own soul seeking expression. True freedom in this process isn't achieved by erasing the other from memory, but by integrating what they awakened. This demands courage, because it's easier to keep the illusion that pain will pass on its own or that, with time, everything will resolve. But time without awareness only numbs. What transforms is the honest confrontation with what still binds us, and often, what binds us isn't the other person but the meaning they assumed. Individuation forces us to reclaim these meanings, reinterpret them, and return them to their proper place within us, no longer projected outward. When you stop checking his profile, you're not merely ending a habit, you're breaking a cycle. You're signaling to your unconscious that the symbolic process of that relationship has concluded, and that now, the psychic energy once invested there can be directed towards something new, you. This is true freedom, not the absence of pain but the presence of choice. The choice not to remain imprisoned by a past that has already served its purpose. The path of individuation is solitary, but not in the sense of isolation. It's solitary because no one can walk it for you, and at the same time, it's deeply connected, because the more you know yourself, the more you connect with others from genuine, not needy places. The bond once sustained by the need to be seen, loved, or validated now transforms into self-embrace. You become the source, and from that source, new bonds may arise, not as replacements, but as conscious encounters. Transforming the bond into self-knowledge means understanding that every person who crosses our path activates a part of us that may have been dormant. They awakened something, and now the responsibility for that activation is yours. The other fulfilled their role. It's up to you to decide what to do with what remains. Continuing to look at them is keeping the focus outside yourself. Turning inward is reclaiming the journey that should never have been diverted. By freeing yourself from this silent habit, you do more than stop accessing a profile. You signal to both your inner and outer universe that you're ready to integrate all you've experienced and move forward. Not toward the other, but back to yourself. And this, as Jung knew, is the only journey truly worth taking. The gesture of checking someone's profile may seem small, almost irrelevant, but when we look at it deeply, it reveals a much larger psychic landscape, a field where memory, desire, projection, shadow, and the need for integration intertwine. Jung shows that what we repeat unconsciously isn't weakness. It's a sign that something within us needs to be seen, welcomed, and transformed. Attachment isn't only to the other, but to what they represented, a part of us asking for passage. Closing a bond isn't erasing the story, but re-signifying it. And true emotional freedom arises when we can return to the other what belongs to them and reclaim what belongs to us. The end becomes a beginning. Pain transforms into awareness, and the external search finally turns into an internal encounter. If this content spoke to you, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, each video is an invitation to inner exploration, expanding consciousness, and the journey toward self-knowledge. Watch the video on your screen now. It will further expand your understanding of what you're experiencing. You are not alone. You are in process, and this process is sacred.